Thank you for joining us for this afternoon segment of the first day of our third Climate Mobility Summit. In a lot of ways, I think this session is a continuity from this morning's session. We'll be discussing the right to stay and how it fits into the larger discussion around climate justice, whether it's global climate justice, whether it's more localized struggles for climate justice. So really looking at this and also discussing kind of who gets to decide about the right to stay versus the right to move. How are some of those decisions being made for people or with people? And I'm very excited to have a very diverse set of perspectives on the panel. And to kick us off, we are honored to have with us former President of Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi, who is also the chair of our Climate Mobility Elders Group. And in this capacity is mobilizing support, champion leaders to support this agenda. So I'm very honored to give the floor to you, Excellency, to give us the keynote remarks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to join this dialogue, one that unites advocates, practitioners, and leaders committed to justice, dignity, and resilience in the face of the climate crisis. Across Africa and the Global South, millions face a cruel irony. They have contributed least to the climate crisis, yet suffer its harshest consequences. Droughts destroy livelihoods, floods wash away homes, crops fail, livestock perish, communities are displaced, not by choice, but by necessity. These are not distant threats, they are lived realities today. As the impacts of climate change intensify, the question of human mobility has rightly come to the forefront of global concern. Around the world, we see growing numbers of people displaced by floods, droughts, desertification, and rising sea levels. Yet for many, the greatest priority is not to move, but to stay. To stay safely, with dignity, rooted in culture, land, and community. Leaving is often neither viable nor desirable. In Botswana, the country of my birth and from where I come, if you're not familiar with it, look up the 4x4, 400 meters world. Sorry, we've only won 3 gold medals in our lifetime, so I had to throw that in. Thank you. In Botswana and across the world continent, communities show remarkable resilience in the face of repeated shocks. But resilience alone is not enough. Adaptation must be robust, inclusive, and well-resourced so that families are not forced to leave homes that have become uninhabitable. Adaptation is central to protecting the right to stay. It requires investments in early warning systems, climate-smart agriculture, water management, land restoration, and social protection. It means building local institutional capacity and ensuring communities help shape the policies that govern their futures. But adaptation is not equally possible everywhere. Botswana has advanced climate planning and sustainable resource management, yet adaptation requires financing, technology, and time. Resources that are scarce, especially to the most vulnerable. This is the central injustice of the climate crisis. Those least responsible are least equipped to withstand its impacts. Still, global climate finance remains heavily skewed towards mitigation, while adaptation, particularly at the local level, is underfunded. If we are serious about climate justice, this must change. Climate finance must be accessible, predictable, and aligned with the needs of affected communities. We must also acknowledge that those needs might change over time. Communities who are determined to stay today may opt for relocation tomorrow. That is why true climate justice must guarantee the right to stay as well as the right to move. It is critical that governments accompany communities on their adaptation journeys, empowering people and communities to make informed choices as circumstances change. Indeed, championing a people-centered approach to climate action means safeguarding people's agency in shaping their future. Those most affected by climate change are not asking for pity. They are asking for partnership and solidarity. They are asking for the means to protect what matters most, their homes, the cultures, and identities. As a climate mobility elder, I am pleased to join this cause, our common cause, convinced that despite political headwinds, the long arm of history bends well in our direction. I thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, President Masisi. Thank you for emphasizing both the global climate justice dimension, so the inequality, injustice that is in the, who bears the burden, who has caused the problem situation, but also some of the more localized questions of climate justice, which communities are most affected, and how do we address the inequities that shape or prevent adaptation journeys within specific local and national contexts. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Elizabeth Campbell. You just met her. So Elizabeth joins us from ODI Global in Washington, where she's the executive director, and she formerly held a senior role in the State Department. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us, and over to you.
Okay, so let me begin by introducing everyone, and we'll start with our problem solver at the end, Michael Chapman. Next, we have Adriana Vasquez, and Amali Tower, and Mithika Wende. So I really just want to jump right in. The topic for today's panel has already been introduced, and start with some guiding questions. I'll ask each of you to kind of respond, and then we can get into some specifics. So the right to stay, how does that fit into the struggle for climate justice? Who gets to decide to stay in place, and whether this is a choice or a constraint? What are the legal frameworks, policies, and investments needed to make staying both dignified and safe? And lastly, how can adaptation and climate finance better support communities who wish to remain in place? So those are a lot of things. You can sort of choose which angle you would like to address. Mithika, should we start with you?
Yes. So just thank you very much, and it was a great pleasure listening to His Excellency Masisi speaking. He has painted that picture actually what happens in the African continent and elsewhere. I'll start by first introducing myself properly. My name is Mifika Mwenda. I am the Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. It's an African continental organization working on intersection of climate and climate justice, and in policy processes across Africa, and mobilizing Africans really to understand what really climate is and what it means to the African people. More or less, many times look at climate change just as an isolated issue of environment and science. And that's the biggest challenge which we have. And so it is really inspiring to see the subject taking center stage at this mobility summit, because it's a mobility issue, it's a migration issue, it's actually affects displacement for people, it's actually intersection of climate and conflict and peace and security. So when you look at it that way, then you will understand the impacts of climate change in all sectors. So in every sector, you'll find that we need to look at it differently. It's an agricultural issue, it's an economic issue, it's a justice issue. And then when we look at it that way, then we look at really you pissed off when you hear the president of the most powerful country declaring climate change a hoax and a con game. So I don't want to say we released a statement based on that. I don't want to say I don't want to be deported very quickly, because that is the practice.
You have the right to remain.
Yeah. So we start from there. So I have a right to remain, but you see there are people who have been having right to remain, but they have been deported for one reason. I don't want to be deported because of climate change, because I've issued a statement which does not please one person. And so for us, the PACJA, or Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, displacement is a reality in Africa. And if you look at the statistics, I just want to mention a few. There is really internal displacement. According to some studies which have been done, displacement in Africa has actually tripled between 2000 and 2023, rising from 10.2 million to 32 million people displaced because of climate crisis. And disasters mostly have gone sixfold. Floods and droughts has made people displacement actually sixfold. And floods have caused around 75% of displacement, especially in the area Masisi comes from and in Eastern Africa. So these are realities which we look at and we live with. And so as an imperative of climate justice, we find actually displacement and climate mobility and people being displaced because of climate really a reality, because the only problem is people are not able to relate that. And this is now why for us, for instance, we are really driving the principles of local land climate action at local level, because adaptation is an imperative for Africa, is the biggest priority in Africa. Because if you want people to live, to have that right to live, you need to ensure that you enable them, you support them to live through adaptation. What does that mean? Because rivers has dried up, they are not able to grow their food. The young people in drier areas affected by drought have to leave to go into cities, and others, not even the cities, they have to cross the ocean. They have to cross the Mediterranean so that they look for opportunities. That is because of the changing climate, because their livelihood and the place they live have become unbearable. And so these are the things which we see, and we need really to provide finances, for instance. That's an imperative of climate justice. and ensure that we provide, if they were relying on, for instance, rain-fed agriculture, and there is no rain, we need to provide alternative. That is more irrigation. How does that work? It works because we need to improve the technology so that people can resort to alternative means of livelihoods.
Thank you. Maybe you could pass the mic, Amali.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. It's searing and echoes a lot of what I hear in my work at Climate Refugees, interviewing people across Africa as well. But I think I'll take us to another part of the world in my comments to talk about recent work we've done in Central America. And let me begin 12 miles from the border of Honduras. I was in a town called Xalagua in Chiquimula, Guatemala, which is in the highlands, the infamous dry corridor. Everyone in this room has to know what the dry corridor is by now, because that's where we have had consecutive and repeated devastating droughts. Guatemala also has suffered the twin hurricanes Eta and Iota in, I believe that was 2020, but time has become a construct. And people are dealing with this. And if anyone working in disaster risk knows that Central America, especially El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and also Honduras have alternatingly, and if not all, are always on the risk indices up in the top 3, top 5, right? And juxtaposition that against U.S. migration policy. The third rail of, I would say, global politics, right, is migration. And as you so well articulated, it's like we're at a time where all migration is bad. Anybody who comes here must be deported. So it was very interesting to be in the borderlands in Central America, in the highlands, where you're talking to indigenous people, you're talking to farmers. And here I was 12 miles from the border with a community of farmers and also people who identified as entrepreneurs. One person was an international law student, which I found incredibly hopeful in the times that we live in, that she wants to study international law. And I had to ask my translator whether he interpreted or translated what was said to me in the Mayan Chorti language. And the following, right off the bat: we just want a chance to stay in our country. That's what a very small community said to me in Guatemala, 12 miles from the border of Honduras. And why is it really important that we were right there at the border of Honduras? Because they went on to say, as I heard in 10 other discussions all throughout the highlands in Guatemala, that people are looking to Honduras as their solution in seasonal and labor migration to survive, not to thrive, to survive. They are dependent on rain-fed agriculture and only rain-fed agriculture. And this community said to me, we just want a chance to stay. As you can see, the rains are late. And they pointed to the stream behind me that was completely dry. Just stones is what I have pictures of. It was weeks and weeks late. So the point is, how do you adapt to a changing climate in which you are not even part of the conversation? Let me now take you to the borderlands in Mexico, in a town called Agua Prieta, where I had the incredible honor of meeting with a group of farmers who 20 years ago started a cooperative under a simple principle. As they put it to me, they said, one farmer said to me, I just wanted my children to not be what I am. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, I didn't want my children to have to leave their home to be someone's undignified labor in your country. That's what we did. And I thought to myself, surely we can all understand that we want better for our children. I don't have children, but I want that for everyone's children, for every generation that follows us, right? It was so simple. It didn't need policy. I didn't need international law. I didn't need jargon to understand an incredibly simple principle. I heard this everywhere I went. I had no agenda to do any work on right to stay, but what I heard in community after community after community was, we don't want to leave. I also met and heard people who just voluntarily told me their deportation stories on the spot in front of everybody, how much money they had spent to even go to the border of US and Mexico, how much debt they were now in because they were immediately, almost immediately apprehended and deported. And this is, last year. So this isn't a new situation. This is failed migration policy. And when you have to juxtapose the right to stay against that as well, because there is money for the solutions that need to be locally led adaptation and loss and damage finance. These architectures exist. There's not enough money. It's not moving fast enough. It's not getting to the people who need it. But side by side, we've been having conversations about root causes. And time again, when you look at all the policy papers that come out about root causes, you'll note the communities that I just gave you a glimpse of are not part of the conversation. They're not invited to the table. I say we take the table and go to them. That's the table we should be at. These are not the rooms where this needs to be discussed. We all should be going to those rooms. So, there are seeds of resistance happening. What they said to me was, so how are we ensuring our right to stay? They didn't quite phrase it that way, right? But I'd like to phrase it that way. And they talked to me about small projects, which are not charity. They wanted investments. They wanted investments so that they can find a new occupation, because I can't be a farmer, is what they kept saying to me over and over again. My father was a farmer. And I said, is it still like that for you? Well, of course not. Then when I would ask collectively, is climate change a factor? A resounding, sí, claro, immediately. It's not complex. People are living this, and I hear this in East Africa and Southern Africa, and a lot of you know my work, so you just heard it, It's like, this is the story. So there are seeds of resistance. The cooperative in Mexico is an extremely good example of 20 years ago, seeing that migration was being barred and criminalized and was so punitive and not a right anymore. They began this cooperative with just $20,000, and today 160 farmers are selling their coffee around the world at fair trade with competitive prices, and these things can be scaled, they can be emulated, they can be replicated, and they can be done so with obviously the tools that we already have in our IFIs. So I just think that, that's the best thing that I can come and say to you. Lastly, I want to say that, based on work we did in Kenya a few years ago, we provided a case study to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage on how can this funding, it's not just enough to provide the funding for people to be able to stay, to adapt, or as necessary, to be able to relocate, or to be compensated for losses and damages. It's also necessary to make that funding accessible at the community level. So how can you ensure a community access window? Because it can't just, we can't just say, oh, localize it and then not actually get into the nitty gritty of, so constitutionally, I looked at Kenya's, governance structures. How can you ensure that somebody who is a minority ethnicity or is indigenous and already leading lives that are legacies of dispossession and, post-colonial struggles, how can they get access to funding? That's also the work we must do, because we can't wait 10, 15 years to get our IFIs in place and then go, wait a minute, the people who most need it don't have the money. So all of these things have to be done at the same time and at scale. And then the very last thing I want to say, I think the previous panel probably did an excellent job of ensuring, we also have to talk about what are the legal frameworks that ensure a right to stay. If there's a right to migrate, there's also a right to stay in the face of the climate crisis. And we have the ICJ's advisory opinion, we have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we have systems that say there's a state obligation here. So there's a lot to unpack, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, I'm Adriana Vasquez. I'm from La Ruta del Clima. We are an NGO based in Costa Rica. We work very closely with communities of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And in the work that we have done in the last years, we had the opportunity as a Mali to work very closely with different communities from the region, a region that is recognized for migrating to the US. And usually when we speak about climate mobility, people said like, no, that's not yet because we don't have the data, because people don't relate their mobilization because of climate change. But as Amali was sharing, in the communities that we have worked, we have realized and identified different cases of people that decide to move after they face an extreme event. For example, Hurricane Eta and Iota, where a lot of communities in the region lose everything, and the only chance that they had was to leave their families and to try to find a place to survive. So it's very interesting too, because usually who stays are the women and the children and the elder. And if you ask them if they want to leave, usually the answer is no. They want to stay. They want to stay because there is their family, there is their culture, and even if they don't are sure if they are going to survive to the next day, they understand that there is their roots, right? So recently we had the opportunity to work also in Costa Rica, in the Pacific coast, with a community that is facing tidal waves, and it's called Caldera, and it's a community that has to be relocated. It has to be relocated because it's not safe to stay there. But one part of the community has been already relocated in more like inside of the territory, but the other part doesn't want to leave. And when you ask the people that don't want to leave, it's usually the elders, the ones that have construct the community. And the reason why they don't want to leave is because they like to hear the sound of the sea in the night. So what show us these examples and these cases, that the right to stay is not only a right, it's also in many cases their mental health is what is going to make that people live longer. Because we have also heard cases, a case in Chile where also we had the opportunity to do some research. It was a community that because of fire, all the community got burned, and they had to be, like they have to displace for some time. And 8 years later, the state construct again the community. And a lot of the people that returned to the community told us that the elders didn't make it, because during the time they were away, they didn't survive, not because they were sick, because they were sad. So at the end, when we're discussing about the right to stay, is not only, I understand that usually you have to discuss it around a safety condition for the people. But if you are thinking about relocating, if you're thinking about putting a group of people in another place, it has to be taken in consideration how they live, their culture, the spaces in the community, because a lot of the people of Chile was telling us that before they had parks and spaces where elder people go and play outside, and when they reconstructed the community, those spaces disappeared. So they have lost like the community fabric and what make them be together. So at the end, we have to think about this, because we understand that Caldera community in Costa Rica needs to be moved to another place. But you cannot just take them inside and not thinking about their relationship with the sea and the relationship between them. So if Amalie and myself, we have lived together for the last 20 years. If we are going to be relocated, we have to think how to put us again together, because that is important, and that makes the sense of community, and that is going to give like the soul of the space. So I think it's part of the discussion that we have to have, because usually when we're thinking about laws and about programs, we think it from here, and not from the territories, from the communities. And the solutions have to be made and construct with the communities and their members, and to consult everyone in the space, and not to wait until we have an extreme event that is going to erase a complete community, and to prepare them, and to know that in the case of Caldera, they are in risk, and if they don't move, it's going to be like losses of lives, and that's not the idea. But how do we make a process that is integral and holistic for that people, so they can continue to be the community that they are right now? Thank you.
Wonderful. My name is Michael. Inadvertently, I wanted to also share some stories from the same region that we've been touching on, which is actually kind of wonderful. I work for ClimateWorks Foundation. ClimateWorks Foundation is, of course, a philanthropy that's historically focused on climate financing, climate funding into many different areas. And recently, about a year ago, stood up an adaptation and resilience team and an adaptation and resilience fund. And as part of that, I've been hired to set up a strategy around climate migration and displacement. And so I'm really both happy that the summit exists, that we're having these conversations, but specifically that we're having a conversation on the right to stay, because I think that's a topic, particularly as a person who's been in displacement for about 15 years, didn't exist originally. It wasn't even part of the conversation, and it's now, a core piece of both immobility, involuntary right to stay, and also forced immobility is another kind of tangent alongside. So first, I just want to say I'm really glad that we're having the conversation at all, which I think is important. About 10 years ago, ironically, I was about 5 miles away from where Amali was speaking with the Chortí women. I was living in Guatemala. My children were small, between the ages of 3 and 5. I lived in Guatemala City, and I managed humanitarian programming across the region. And at that time, there had been cyclical droughts already starting, but it was at the beginning of about a 3-year period that we were seeing. And so it wasn't really, it's a dry corridor, of course, but it wasn't really clear whether it was going to be a permanent phenomenon or if it was going to be kind of a regular period. And these Chortí women came all the way to Guatemala City. They came to my office, which is a very long distance, and they told me about the ways in which all of the men had left their community. And they were left as the women elders in the community to take care of the children. And they looked at me and said, "Help us stay on our ancestral land." It's not a singular story. There's many, particularly women, who are left behind in heavily outflowing migrant communities, who really want to stay, not only to hear the sea, not only to continue their way of life, but also to be rooted in a place that has been there for centuries for them. So I went to visit. It was true, there was literally no men in the community. And there was a young girl who was dying of malnutrition, and my daughter was the same age at the time. So that was particularly hard to see, that there were these choices and these trade-offs that they were facing by saying, I want to still stay here, but I also literally need to save my daughter, or my granddaughter in that case. And also, the men are making very difficult choices. They were moving to the southern coast to cut sugarcane, which because of the extreme heat due to climate change, causes severe kidney failure at the ages of 25, 26, 27 years old. So they're forced to make, again, decisions that still put them in harm's way. So I appreciate the stories, and it's unfortunate, devastating that the same communities are facing the same levels of drought and displacement. And so that experience, we did respond. I'll save that story for if you want to get some coffee. But what that experience taught me was that people do not want to move. They want the agency to decide when and if to move. And that's something that gets lost in the narrative on the international level. And the second thing I learned at the time, and again, I'm old enough to where this feels like it just happened, but it's over a decade ago. It was the first time we were talking about a southern border crisis in the U.S., and it was the first time where we had a root cause analysis in the Northern Triangle. And it was framed around loss of livelihoods, family reunification, and social violence as the 3 root causes. And nowhere in the conversation was climate change, even though these same women, who most people would look at and say you're uneducated, you're illiterate, the first thing they would say to me is, this is climate change. This we would not normally see this, and there's no other reason for it. And yes, people were seeking economic opportunities in America, but why, right? And so it was the second thing it taught me was that we're looking at the root causes incorrectly. So speaking on the actual topic around, how does philanthropy see itself? And I'm not going to speak toward finance at the international level, but specifically to philanthropy. And I'm very new to philanthropy, 6 weeks new to philanthropy. Coming from the humanitarian sector, I think it's really important, and I'm actually very proud that today every single person on this panel has rooted it in the human experience, that we at ClimateWorks believe in taking a human-centered approach, and everyone is basing it in that same reality. I think that's really important. We lose sight very quickly, especially when we talk about financing. We lose sight of the humans who are having to make these difficult choices. So I appreciate that everyone's bringing that up. But the role of philanthropy, particularly, I see it as being able to raise an alarm, both for the public and also for the rest of philanthropy, that this is a critical issue. And so again, I'm glad that the summit even exists. And I think the second piece is around that experience I had and recognizing the siloed nature of the problem. And so I think a role of philanthropy and many other actors needs to be to identify it as an intersectional issue. Climate migration touches on so many other issues around water management, ag, labor, policy. You could name 55 more probably. And so I think if we don't work together and collaborate across philanthropy, across multilaterals, et cetera, we're going to be missing the benefit of pooling our resources and also attacking an issue jointly. So 4 specific ways that I view, and we at ClimateWorks view philanthropy, the role of philanthropy. First is around narrative building. I think it's extremely important that we use our resources to change the public narrative on this, and also to advocate. So lifting up particularly the voices of community members who are specifically impacted. So I think it's a critical role. Second would be knowledge and learning. Where are the data gaps? How can we fund in to ensure that we have the right data so that we can be telling the right story? And how are we sharing those learnings? I think I personally am a little bit hesitant to continue to fund research, but I do think there continues to exist data gaps, particularly on climate mobility, that we need to continue to fund into. That's just a bias because I'm a humanitarian, not a researcher, so like I kind of want to help people. No beef with researchers. So anyway. Third would be around technical assistance, capacity building. That's a little bit of a wonky term to say we really want, we really want to ensure we're supporting particularly cities who are dealing with absorbing and integrating migrants, and communities who are trying to assist people to stay in place or people who choose to move. How can we really support subnational mechanisms to deal with this crisis, and also the civil society organizations that many of you are supporting with, advocating for, and who are yourselves? How can we support you in ensuring you have the technical resources, the capacity, the funding itself, the data to do your jobs better? And then finally, but I do think probably more important, or where often we're looked at, we being philanthropy is looked at, is around risk capital, and innovation. I think we do play a role in ensuring that really creative ideas that don't have proof of concept yet can get tested, can get spun out. I think that's where a lot of movement is on insurance, is on financing, is on a number of other areas that, for many reasons that most of you probably understand, governments aren't wanting to take on that risk. Private sector is not yet wanting to take on that risk. Philanthropy can play that role. And so you may have heard we opened up a large window on adaptation in extreme heat. And one of the purposes of that is to test new ideas, to get sort of a dragnet of interesting and innovative ideas that we could potentially test out to scale and hand over to a donor that can come behind it and sustainably fund it, or gather learnings from that innovation so that we could potentially weave that into some other programming. I'll stop there. Those are 4 key points around philanthropy that I think are important, but more importantly, I appreciate that everyone is continuing to keep the communities that we're trying to serve in mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone. So I just want to ask you, I'm going to kind of come back to all of you. I have a sort of a question that emerged having listened to all of you, and then we'll come to the audience for questions. But I mean, I think there's clear consensus that, you know, the right to stay is a powerful sentiment in communities across the globe, that maybe it's been overlooked because the narrative has really been about the people who are on the move, and, you know, we know that climate hasn't really been a piece of this. We know that there's a lot of financing. We know there's a lot of capital. But we also know that the financing capital isn't always structured to effectively address the needs that you all have so well articulated today. I think there's a consensus that it all has to be specific, it has to be locally led and driven. But I was wondering if maybe you could share ideas of examples where you have seen funding approaches from any, whether it's governments, you know, whatever the mechanism, that really you would sort of hold up as there needs to be more of this. This is the way, you know, that we can really begin to help people realize their ambitions to stay. And related to that, and it's interesting to know, Michael, your sort of humanitarian background, you know, we talk a lot about resilience, and we always talk about that as if it's like a different type of money, you know, but like and different from development, and definitely different from humanitarian. But like, what really is it? Is it we want to do development work, locally led development work that takes into consideration serious climatic change? Or is there something more to it? So that's sort of what is on my mind listening to all of you. Would you like to begin?
So I was just figuring out when the last speaker, Michael, you know, this is what we experience every time, and the question is, when does that woman at very local level, the woman farmer whose crops are dried up and she has no choice rather than to adapt, and the person, the local farmer who has been also affected by heat waves, and the fisher folk who has been displaced because of the rising sea levels. And so one of the things which we have really to acknowledge is sometimes they may not have that choice whether to live or not. And this is determined, and will policymakers, for instance, have that leverage of prescribing what is right for those communities, because that's what has been happening all over. This brings the question of procedural justice. And when we are doing, because it starts with policies at the global level, at the UNFCCC level, for instance, then trickle down in the names of these policies, NDCs, for instance, the National Adaptation NAPAs, and so forth and so forth. And these communities are very little, you know, to decide on when that is being happening, when they are even never consulted. In fact, why these policies fail, I'm a public policy expert. And the biggest challenge which we have with these policies, whether it's NDCs, national determined contributions, which are determined by the countries, but at the end of the day, you find that they are not, even the people are never consulted. They are just decided by consultants and then imposed by people to those communities. So they hardly even understand what that means. What they hear, there is big money for climate change. So I want to give you one of the key examples, really imperative example of climate justice, Kenya. And this is actually a program called Financing Locally Led Climate Action. It's called FLOCA. So what we did, and if you look at it, we are the civil society. In fact, we are the ones who originated this. And we realized that limiting this kind of climate action and these solutions and these policy processes at the Ministry of Environment will never work. So we had to engineer and then made this process an entire government approach. So what did we do? Is really ensuring that that unit of climate finance is positioned at the Ministry of Finance. And so it became now a budgetary issue. We ensured that whether it is the national planning, it is planned at that level, we decide, but of course the World Bank came and they really was able to support that program. So Kenya has an evolved system of government, so it trickles down. So the decisions are made by people at very local level, and the framework which was done so that it fits with the people, ensured that the decisions are made from the local level coming up. I can assure you that because I've been in this climate discourse process for the last maybe 10, I've attended 10 COPs, and every time we are there, we want climate money to go to the communities. We want communities to decide, but we are never. So I can assure you this program was able to unlock that and ensure that now the devolved systems of government, and not only the devolved system of government, but also at very local level, at the ward level, the smallest unit of governance. Communities are done at ward level. So the farmers, women, youth, and everybody, there is a very elaborate framework. And then it trickles down goes down up to the national level. So what does this mean? So we have seen really remarkable progress and understanding and contribution by people, and people making decisions on whether we want a borehole at this village level, we want you to fund tree planting, we want this, we want solar panels to power our water, solar power and water systems, and it has worked. And this, because of that success of that program, now it is being replicated in all the entire Eastern and Southern Africa, and many partners are falling into it because it's a workable framework. So these are things, there are many things, innovations which work, either at policy level, but also at solutions level. What we need to do is really to to ensure that communities are not tabula rasa. They have also their own solutions. The biggest challenge with the climate discourse process is that there are those experts which thinks that they have solutions. But if we value the knowledge power of the community, then the indigenous knowledge, the youth power, the youth innovations. We are just from Africa Climate Summit just the other day. We were doing the innovations for youth with African Union and other partners. You could see the solutions these young people have, but because they are never given an opportunity to do this, they will never really unleash that potential which they have. So the point here is that communities have their own solutions. If we bank on those solutions, and if we focus on them, we are going to solve the climate crisis. We have the solutions. What we need is to trust in ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, amen. Agree with every single word. Yeah, and that's exactly what, with Kenyan partners, we were able to inform the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, this devolved governance structures that do exist in Kenya as a model, the ward governance. But let me stick with Kenya, because to your question, that's actually what popped into mind immediately. I've spent a lot of time, I've lived in Kakuma refugee camp, Kenya's second largest camp, and until the Syrian crisis, was the second largest camp in the world. Anyway, that's a great example of what you're talking about in terms of young people. There is a refugee leader who's young, who's very well known, who has been trying for years to buy enough trees to plant around the schools so that children can return to school in UNHCR-led refugee camps. And you might wonder, why can't they go to school? School's free, this is a refugee camp. Because the desertification is so extreme, the extreme heat is so unbearable that children have stopped going to school. Now, I've heard these stories, sticking with Kenya, outside of camps as well, to Kenyan nationals. But think about it, if the structure within a humanitarian-run refugee camp is breaking down, and it's up to a refugee to then say to me, hey, Molly, do you know any sources of funding? We're on 3 years where I've been pitching this to people. I can't say this enough. We're waiting for the bulb and everything to be like, oh, there it is, that lightning bolt of the really simple solutions. You know, because we all know what happens if you educate those children. We know what we're trying to pursue durable solutions for refugees. If someone's going to be resettled and they've had education in that camp, what does that look like in your third country resettlement? What does that look like for the generation that follows? So climate plays an incredible role in also eroding someone's right to stay while exiled from their country. So, you know, it's just the most pressing, salient example that popped right into my head to your question.
Thank you. I think I don't have an example that comes to my mind, but I want us to reflect a little about why, if we have the funding and why, if there are the resources, we are not having the right responses, right? And I think it's because right now policies and legal frameworks are not focusing on human dignity and people well-being, are more focused on the profit that it is going to make to the people who is given the money. So I think it's very challenging when we are trying to think about resources for the communities, when we know that we are an NGO, so we apply constantly to funds, to grants, to develop projects in the communities. And when you see and you read the conditions for the funding, you are like, okay, so we have this community, they have this need, but this funding goes in this way, so let's see how can we manage to make it match, because we understand that the community needs the funding, that they have the idea, that they have the solution, but the grants available are not matching. And on the discussion around the loss and damage fund for responding to loss and damage, it is not even an option for direct access right now. So if there is no direct access, it's going to be national access. That means that a lot of the things that they are going to do maybe are not going to respond to the needs of the community. So I think we have to question that, and also to understand that if we don't put the people in the center of the solution, it's not going to work. And it's a thing about responsibility, because in other space that we have been discussing this week around reparations and the ICJ and the Inter-American Court, the climate change in our communities results of the lack of commitment and responsibility of the global north. So it's very funny, because when you think about funding, and it's very frustrating for us as organizations from the global south, that each dollar that we receive, we know where it goes and we know how it's being used. It's very frustrating to see that there's funding, but it's not getting where it has to get. And Costa Rica right now is not even a low-income country. Now we are high-income country. So how are we going to bring money to our territories, to our communities, when right now we should be giving money, right? So in these spaces, I think we have to start questioning the way that we are giving the money, because at the end, it responds a lot on business models and not the needs of the communities, the realities of the countries, and the actions that they want to do. Because we work with a group of women in Costa Pájaros in Costa Rica, and they want to do a lot of projects, but they are paying a loan of $10,000 for having a small business that is not even working. So it's not that there's no ideas or not capacity, is that the funding is not responding to the communities. Thank you.
Yeah, just probably real briefly, and I will barely try to answer the second question. I appreciate the examples, and I've got similar concerns around the ways the financing mechanisms kind of land at the national level. So I do think there's a gap at the subnational and particularly at the community level, just as a general comment. Again, back to my point, I think philanthropy is here to try to work on that a little bit. In a post-USAID world, that becomes much more challenging in terms of the gap, but I still think it's really relevant. A couple of examples, I think, of some positive ways I've seen funding working to support communities. I point to the Mayor's Migration Council has had some excellent examples of some city-led funding, city-led designs for some migration-related work. I'll juxtapose my own personal failure with one example of success that I heard from them, just out of like humility, I guess. In El Salvador, around the same time, talked about we had a managed retreat project that we were trying to work through to get a community that had been impacted by heavy rains, hit by a landslide, and get them essentially a new piece of land. 12 years on, well after I had left, they still had no access to the land, no homes built, and a particularly frustrating bureaucratic problem with the city of San Salvador. And so seeing the Mayor's Migration Council Global Fund for Cities have a successful managed retreat project, I think it was in Beira in Mozambique, where the city is coming to a fund to say we need to work on this, then there's better buy-in. So I fully agree that the community needs to have the voice in that, and in this case the community was saying, hi, we need to not be rained on every night and have the water come into our houses. So yes, I think coming from the city or the community was important. Having the city really be on board for that is quite a linchpin given my own personal experience of total failure. So I think examples like that are really important where you have a number of stakeholders. And then on the resilience topic, what are we talking about when we talk about it? I'm not a resilience expert at all, and I would say I equally don't fully grasp how it needs to be differentiated. But I do think there's really helpful ways to think about it being a particular lens on development funding. And so if we think about classically development funding is only going to look at a particular angle for outcomes, meaning like in agriculture, we just want the yields to be there. In resilience funding, my interest within philanthropy would be to say, how are we, yes, doing that work to have the yields increase or whatever, but how are we making it in a climate smart fashion? How are we also bringing a lens around gender, around right to stay, and some of those other elements to essentially kind of modify the approach to ensure that there's a resilience component to something that would historically have been a development fund. As a humanitarian actor in my past, with my personal hat on, I would say that's very much not like humanitarian funding, but it does start to get into that blend, so that we understand sort of shorter term outcomes and climate change outcomes, layering that on top of some development outcomes that would historically be there. So it's a little bit messy, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Esieno Koisin. I'm a PhD candidate at Drexel University in Philadelphia. I'm working on the intersection of climate science and spirituality. I'm originally from Nigeria, and I have a short question for all the panel and a specific question to Mr. Mitika. So last week, I was in Mexico for the Global Climate Justice Camp, and I was a little bit disappointed because most of the conversations were centered around the Global South. I understand that the Global South faced the brunt of global climate change crisis because of whatever. I know there are a lot of convictions regarding that. But then I come to realize that when we're talking about global climate mobility, a lot of people tend to leave the Global South and then move to the Global North, where they still face some of this relatable climate crisis. And the funny thing is that even some indigenous communities in Global North states still face this crisis too. But they tend to be struck out of global conversations when it comes to climate justice. And I ask, what then is the meaning of climate justice if some people get struck out just because they left a particular location to a place that is assumed to be very perfect, but they still face these situations? And I really want to know what climate justice could really mean in that regard. And then, drawing from my experience in climate science and spirituality, I really agree with you, Mr. Mitika, when you said that, excuse me, when you say that our indigenous practices towards resolving climate crisis or climate change can be very viable, I really agree with you. But again, I want to point out, like a question, that sometimes our indigenous practices can be laced with a lot of misinformation and some denials to to scientific sense. For instance, an indigenous tribe can really endorse green economy, afforestation, and the rest of that. But that doesn't replace their cosmological interpretations of some of these climate change crises from the lens of spirituality. And in that situation where which they have usable strategies and they are still faced with these misinformations, how do we balance such gaps? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. George Scharfenberger from the University of California, Berkeley. I'd like to, if I may, add a slightly different dimension to that, and that's one of history and time. The human race began as nomads, and humans have been moving based on climate, not the thing, but certainly the climate for long before any of us were on the earth. So I guess the question I have is, in climate mobility, what is the time frame we're talking about? If we're talking about solutions to immediate problems, that people need to leave now, or they're stressed now and helping them, that's one thing. But if we're talking about where things are going to be 20 years from now, is it not possible that trying to help people stay where they are inadvertently puts them more at risk to the ultimate climate crisis that's going to come upon them? And would it not, at least to some degree, begin starting pathways, perhaps with the youth, to start that process of migration to different areas, rather than focusing on one or the other?
Thank you. My name is Espen Ronenberg. I work for the Secretariat of the Pacific Community based in Fiji. I just wanted to make a couple of comments first around the question you posed about who decides when communities should leave. Well, one of the best examples is the relocation framework that the Fiji government has instituted, where even before you need 90% of the community to agree to begin discussions about moving, not about actually moving, but to begin discussions before they even get to the point about moving. So that's one example. Another example about mechanisms that work to channel financing to communities is also the relocation fund that they've established, which although it's a mechanism housed under the Ministry of Finance, it does have legal mechanisms for direct payments to communities. And this is the reason why the Pacific and AOSIS have been calling for the use of national mechanisms for the Loss and Damage Fund to operate. But we've been able to establish these types of national mechanisms, and we think that they can work. So the question is, why is it not possible to replicate this everywhere? Because I think we have a little model that works for a small country. Maybe it can be upscaled to bigger countries. Thank you.
Local communities, and do they always have, shall we say, the best?
Yeah. So thank you very much for your question and comment. My organization is one of the organizations which pioneered the notion of climate justice since it started, I think, some 20 years ago. And the concept itself is contested, you know. It doesn't have that universal definition, and who owns it. And that's actually the reality. We, particularly in the African continent, are also trying to see the African narratives of climate justice. What really does it mean? So for us, for instance, what we are looking at it at through African lenses is climate justice is really giving the communities which do not have voice, to give them a voice. So that's it's opposed to the north, the US and those others, which have other interpretations of climate justice. So the interpretation of climate justice depends on where you come from and contextualized to where those people who are speaking about this. But when you talk about that spirituality, and she was talking about the really indigenous knowledge, and this really means it's very passionate. It's looking at when you are talking about displacement. You know, some people and communities are connected to their land through that spirituality, and culturally you cannot move because there are even graves there where they are living with their people. Though somebody died, they are connected with their graves. So you cannot come just and displace them there. Their graves and then their ancestors and the living dead. So you know that African, socialism is very complicated. So that's actually now, that's why indigenous knowledge is very important. But coming really to the question of then climate justice itself, we really need to look at the broader sense of it and look at who is going to define it for ourselves and which movement are you going to join. They are like the Asian movements are a bit radical than the others, and they look at it at that level. But the way we are seeing in Africa, I've mentioned the Africa Climate Summit, which brings together all the people from all walks of life. We realize that our leaders cannot solve the climate crisis alone, so it is a multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral kind of engagement. While looking at climate change, we are not looking at it in that sense, lenses of victimhood. We are looking at the providers of solution. And we want to be seen as those communities have their own solutions. And that's why we are seeing, looking at the definition and the outcome of the African Climate Summit, which is being presented here, is you want to look at it, what would the renewable energy revolution present in terms of mitigation and opportunities for Africa carbon sinks, for instance. The Africa is vast in renewable energy, in wind power, in solar, and in geothermal, in a continent which actually 600 million people live in energy poverty. And so when linking at that with now the adaptation efforts, how can that energy be used to drive that energy? And then there is also the issue of just transition, also an imperative of climate justice. The 30% of the minerals, just transitional minerals, lithium, copper, cobalt, and those others, driving the new technologies, electric cars, renewables, and those others, they are found in Africa. And so looking at that and talking about even climate finance, how do you look at this positively rather than looking at me as a recipient of charity, instead of looking at me as really having those vast resources? So there are all these conversations. So why sometimes we break away from that movement is because of really looking at that solutions which we want, because some of them want to really be stuck in history without realizing that the things are moving, and we need a conversation which moves us forward. So let me leave it. Thank you.
So maybe on the second question, Adriana and Amali, if you want to tackle it. Do we put people at more risk if we urge them or support them or facilitate them to stay?
Yeah. So first I would say that we don't tell people what to do. Migration is a right. And the right to stay should be encompassed in that right if we are to exercise it fully. I say those words while migration is being barred everywhere in the global north, especially. More money is spent on border securitization to the tune of $400 billion since 2003 in this country alone. So I'm not sure where this welcome would come from, which is why I would look to our... Right. So, number one, internal displacement. I think there's always a misnomer that, do you think people are moving into better positions or better situations if they're internally displaced or internally migrating? They're not. Let's go to Kenya again. Do you know how many people are moving into the informal settlement, the slum that is Kibera, right? we're not seeing people moving into veteran situations. A lot of this also has to do with a lot of racist immigration policy. People who look like me aren't welcome around the world. So I don't know how we would facilitate these things. But having said that, let's look at Africa and how welcoming it is and how much it is leading in better migration policy in its African Charter on Human Rights, on the IDP Charter, the Kampala Convention, and then its own regional instruments with ECOWAS in East Africa as well, where the words climate, refugee, migration, displacement, drought-based displacement, all are actually articulated in governance structures that work for the entire continent, to the point now where you have instruments that you can ratify and say, hey, if I'm Ugandan and I need to move for purposes of climate, then the same sovereign rights that a Ugandan has as an IDP in Uganda would also apply in a neighboring country. So these are the things that I would lift up as leadership and examples for your very point about how can we facilitate migration for those who want to move. I just think we have to also then posit that against very bad examples of what we're doing and how much we're spending to ensure that people are stuck and blocked.
Thank you. I'm going to be very quick about the topic of global north and global south. I think it's very important to see it also from a perspective of colonialism, because it's not that inside of the countries of the global north there are not people that is excluded. So I think we have to have that in mind. Then about the migration, is migration with dignity. And when we talk a lot about internal migration, they move from a rural part to the city trying to find a good work, and at the end is not the answer, and they don't find a good work, they don't find where to study, where to bring their children. So it's not dignifying for them, and they want to come back to the rural part where they were from. There are cases where yes, but it's not in all the cases, and there's no policy around it. And about the direct access of the loss and damage fund, I think it's important the state access. I don't disagree on that, but also we need direct access, especially in context when we know that maybe there are different conditions in the country, and that even the government is not very involved in the loss and damage and is not very committed to addressing loss and damage. So that's why direct access is still being important for a lot of the communities. So I think the access to the states is good, to the governments, but we also need direct access from our perspective. Thank you.
And Michael, maybe this question on replicability of models and how you see that from where you sit.
On replicability.
Of effective models,
yeah.
Right?
Great. Yeah, I think it's important to raise up the great examples that are happening in the Pacific particularly, and I'd commend all of you for doing excellent work in setting up frameworks and also setting up, I think, replicable models that many of us are, we're asking the same question, essentially. Not, I can't speak for all of us, but many of us are asking the same question. Essentially, sort of, how can we replicate that further, and how can we also build mirroring models that could be windows for subnational access, or, GCCM has some managed funds that are separate from loss and damage. So I think the short answer is I would hope that that's the case. And as you continue to push, both on the framework and pathway side for like the Tuvalu example, or the model that you have on financing, I would hope that we can continue to share and try to build it elsewhere. And people are interested in doing that, but I don't know all the very higher level negotiations on making that happen, but I think there's a lot of kind of a groundswell to see it happen elsewhere.
Let's try to take one more round of questions, and then we can ask our panelists to make some final.
Whoa, saving the day. Thank you.
Thanks so much to the panel. Hi, my name is Juliana. I'm with the International Rescue Committee. My question is in particular for Adriana. So in response to your discussion of the displacement of communities in certain uninhabitable geographies, and this dimension of protection that you described that goes beyond basic safety, and it's really about attempting to preserve the environmental conditions and the social dynamics to conserve as much of the community as possible. So if these conditions can't necessarily be met, like in rural to urban migration, for example, kind of what trade-offs are accessible, and what is the role of humanitarian organizations in facilitating the recreation of these conditions? Thank you.
Okay. Está complicado.
So thank you. I would like to comment on what you have discussed about issues, the communities not wanting to move because of some cultural or belief. Okay, like I know of community where they don't move because they feel their, the belly button. Okay, that the belly button has been, it has been disposed, in that community. Therefore, they can't leave because when they die, how are they going to connect with that? Okay, so spirituality works a lot with people, and some people feel their ancestors are there. They cannot leave, even though, like in Islam, like that is not truly the case, but they still believe it because of the culture of the people. Okay, and then my question here is, how do you deal with such community? Is there any law that, can make them move even when they don't want to move because of their safety, So that's my question.
I'll pass it to.
Okay. Once again, my name is Chiamaka from the GCCM. It's more about the onus on the states, the countries in this regard in protecting the right to stay. I think typically when we talk about the right to stay, we talk about, the role of, international bodies, international legal frameworks. But then I've been thinking on reflecting on this on the right of the governments themselves, And in reflecting on this, I thought of my own country, Nigeria. I'm also in Nigeria, and in Chapter 2 of our Constitution, it has the responsibilities of the government, in this case, to protect and advance the socio-economic needs of the people, right? But then in the same Chapter 2 that provides these responsibilities of the government, it has a section 6C, that says that it is not justiciable. And so we see once again that most times we talk about, the right to not be forcibly displaced as discussed in the previous panel. And there's a need for, greater emphasis on the role that states have to play, countries have to play in protecting the people in their territories, in advancing their well-being, in recognizing and codifying laws that makes it possible for people within their territories to live dignified lives. And by living dignified lives, they are empowered to make dignified decisions if they want to move. Their dignified mobility pathways. So I think it goes back. These national laws are important, and I think it's important to place emphasis on that too. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. From the cases that I know from planned relocation, I have a case that comes to my mind that it's a community in Panama, Gunayala, that has been relocated, and they were relocated they were from an island, and then they were relocated in the ground. I don't know how to say it in English. But the thing is that they didn't consider the access to water, for example, in the planning, even if there was a plan of 10 years to do the relocation process. And from the other experiences that I have known, it's usually like they move the community, but they didn't consider like cultural aspects or access to education as easy as it was before, or even access to roads. So one experience that we have had is to develop a tool to to help the governments to do like a checklist and to see how much it costs for them to really know, to really do a complete process of relocation. But let's see, it has to be like a very integral process where you really take in account all the aspects of the community, and there are going to be things that you cannot do, like the example of the belly button, for example. But at least to try to recognize the process of the community, and at the same time the place that is not going to be habitable for living in the future, you have to also do a cicatrization process so other people don't come and live there because they are going to be in danger. But I think we are not yet there. There's a lot of work that we need to do, and there's an aspect that is very important, that is a capacity building in the governments, especially local governments that are the ones that in the context that I know are facing the problems, and they have to do the solution, and usually they don't have the resources to do an integral process. So we have to think also in that aspects of capacity building for the governments, for the community, and the resources that you need to do a process that take in account all these aspects. Thank you.
Thanks. Michael, response to the questions or any final thoughts?
No, I don't have any more response to the questions. Maybe just to address kind of the question on timeframes and on, sort of maybe trade-offs or what ifs. And I think partly to sum up, some comments. I think the recognition of what I hear today, is around choice and dignity, and whether that is the right to stay, and whether that's the need to move if you're potentially forced to or not forced to. And I think as we think about the full pendulum of the climate migration conversation, that's where addressing each of the pillars or components, however you kind of structure the framework, simultaneously is actually really critical, so that we are opening up pathways, we are enabling the environment in the policy sphere, we're changing narratives around receptivity and xenophobia, and we're also looking at how to support effective integration, and we're also supporting loss and damage and recompensation. So we could debate the time scale, and yes, maybe the shorter term piece is trying to prepare and prevent people from having to make that really difficult choice, but it's also really important to look at the longer time scale and recognize the window is going to be shifting, the habitable window is going to be shifting. That's not our choice to make about when and where those people move, but if we can create an enabling environment across all the pillars, they can hopefully make that choice for themselves across, the 20 years that you're talking about. Thanks.
Thank you. Amali, over to you. Any specific responses or final thoughts? What?
We're making sure you have a microphone.
Oh, okay. I think I'll just offer an answer to your question and some closing remarks to say that, much like what Adriana was just saying, it's never a goal to force anyone to move, but there will be times when people have to move. Here in the United States, Newtok, Alaska, 20, and I'm being generous by saying 20 years, decades and decades of the community first trying to express to the United States government, different administrations, what their problems were. Indigenous people who have just legacies of, being extracted, colonialism, dispossession, you name it, right? So there's this incredible marginality there. And then you come across, after decades and decades, they have to move because of climate change in Alaska. There's a lot of flaws, and I'm not going to get into but the point is it's a co-designed process of trying to determine solutions for people who may have to move. So yes, early response, we have to be responding now. If you go back to what I said about Central America, right? Responding once someone is in a disaster or in a really precarious situation is not the goal. The goal should be to know fully well, to not deny, first of all, that these are realities, climate or not, right? To deny that it's to lose right away. But let's say, you have to accept these are the risks, these are the extra sources of vulnerability because of social inclusion and all these legacies that are now exacerbated by climate change as well, and to prepare communities in a way that they want. What does that preparedness look like for them? So it's about co-designing, co-leading, really showing up and listening, not bringing your ideas, not bringing your agendas, you know, so that you are open to hearing a community talk to you about a cultural way of life that maybe doesn't present your own, but you can hopefully have some respect for, and then think about, so how do we design a solution that also encompasses your need to be connected to the umbilical cord, to your ancestries, to the graves of ancestors that continue to live because I have proximity to their graves. You know, your story, it's replicated all over the world, right? So that's the point, right? So preparing now, ahead of time, early, and to your point also about like what legal frameworks exist. We have cultural laws. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have indigenous rights. You know, are these things being enforced, especially in a time where international law is being eroded as we speak? Yes, that's problematic too. So we have to be doing all of these things all at once. And surely sitting here in the global north, we have the resources to do every single one of the things that we have all touched upon here, all at the same time.
Mithika, final words.
My final one is that we are living in a very complex world, and communities, it is just part of the evolution. You want it or not, change is inevitable. I normally tell people that the transition to low carbon, climate resilient development pathways, reshaping and redefining climate action, as I've mentioned, climate change from the way it was framed, that adaptation, for instance, is looked at something which is charitable, and mitigation is what some people need to invest in, is different. We need to turn it into opportunities, and that's what we are telling our communities. And the other point is really creating that ownership. Whatever policies which are being done, they must consider that community which needs to live where it is supposed to do, but because of the changing climate, we need really to convince them that we are not forcing you out. We would want you to stay, but because you are going to your village is going to be inundated, it's better for you because you need to survive. So we need really to paint that picture. We need to help communities, but the way things are done, the top-down model of working and policy making has dramatically failed. So what the only solution is bottom-up, community-centered, people-owned solutions and policy frameworks. So if we want to insist on that, then we'll turn climate from really a challenge into opportunities, and communities are going to embrace that. It's happening in many places. So community solutions are the key things, but who are left behind? Our friends from the north. But we need to move from really tensions to solidarity. We need to convince each other. And the next thing we are going to do is we will look for Donald Trump and tell him that he is now we give him an example of that, the Titanic. You know the Titanic? The Titanic, when it sank, many people died. But we talk us in Africa, and the vulnerable are the ones who are in the lower deck. Trump is up there. He thinks that now he's very safe. But when it sinks, all of us sink. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. He dropped the mic, but I will only say this. Choice and dignity, locally led, money needs to respond to, not drive solutions. The right to remain, to stay in one's place is a core piece of environmental justice. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our panelists.